Support for this program was provided by the Kansas School Board Resource Center. From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek Studio, PBS Kansas presents Resolving the Literacy Crisis in Kansas Schools.
Education leaders say it's difficult for many people to comprehend that Kansas has a literacy crisis. We all want to believe that children get a good education when we send them off to school. Some students certainly do, but many do not. Over 100,000 students, nearly 1 out of 3, struggle to read. And many experts contend that student outcomes have been steadily falling. And the slide started long before COVID. I'm Jemelle Holopirek, your host for a 3-part series on resolving the literacy crisis in Kansas schools. In this hour, we're talking about how the literacy crisis came to be, starting with some perspective on how the education system changed over the years. We'll also look at student achievement trends and discuss the impact that the Kansas literacy crisis is having on higher education and the workforce. Our final segment is about the design and function of the Kansas education system, which some experts believe is part of the problem. In part 2, we'll explore the barriers to academic success. We'll conclude the 3-part series with good news. There are many steps local school boards and legislators can take to stop the slide and deliver positive results quickly. The literacy crisis has been building for decades, and not just in Kansas. Kim Strassel, a columnist and editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal, has observed the education decline as both a journalist and a mom, and she joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Kim. We really appreciate it. And I believe your concerns about education were accelerated about 2 decades ago when your oldest child started school. Now tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Jemelle, and it's wonderful to be part of this. Yeah, I remember thinking when my first child was born, and that would be almost now 21 years ago, understanding that no matter where I sent him to school or my subsequent children, that he was not going to get the education that he needed to succeed in the world. And by the way, I viewed that as a problem, whether he had attended a public school or a private school. My kids did attend public schools. And it wasn't that there aren't good intentions, but that we have simply seen these scores dropping. And so my children, ever since they were little, they went to school and then they would come home and do their homework. And then I made them do mom school. I called it mom school. They hate that term. But and we did all the things that it was just very clear that they were not getting in their own classrooms, not just including rigorous reading and mathematics, but history, civics, geography, all of those things, because there's just so many problems in the district. Some of it's watered down standards. Some of it's a lack of attention to the things that matter.
And when you were in Wichita a few months ago, you told an audience, we don't have an education problem in this country, we have an education crisis. Why do you believe that?
Well, because it's now beyond, it's simply beyond dispute. I think that this has happened in such a slow rolling fashion that people sometimes struggle, as you noted in your opening, to step back and realize that we have massive numbers. The majority of our children are not performing even at the watered down standards that we have developed over the time in most basic subjects. I mean, look at the statistics of kids who are graduating from high school who we know lack a functional ability to engage in standard reading and writing. It's extremely worrisome, and it becomes more of a crisis if you consider that other countries in the world, our competitors for jobs and developments, are not doing the same. They're expecting far more from their kids and doing a better job in their educational systems.
And how do you think our expectations changed over the years regarding what students should know and be able to do?
Well, you mentioned that Kansas event I was at, and one of the things I talked about the audience, I found this fascinating exam from 1912 from a county called Bullitt County in Kentucky. And it was what kids were expected to know if they wanted to graduate from 8th grade. And 8th grade graduation was a big deal because a lot of kids at that time, especially if you were a farm kid, that was the highest education you were going to get. And so it was expected of you that you go out and you finish that 8th grade with a functional knowledge of everything you needed to sort of survive in the world, whether it was in farming or in a different job or even working in the household. And those questions on that test, it was remarkable. It was reading, writing, grammar, spelling, the arithmetic and accounting sections were a little challenging even for me. The history sections were remarkable. Kids were required to know all our mountains and lakes and rivers in this country, be able to name foreign countries and foreign rivers and lakes. History, they had to be able to talk about different battles that have been fought, and not just the big ones, not the Civil War, but the Battle of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and civics. They had to understand how government worked, separation of powers, but also what the duties and responsibilities of elected officials in their own states were. I mean, it was really something to read this and realize that now we're just sort of happy if a kid can read a passage by the time they're graduating from high school, and we've really let our children down.
And Kim, how do you think we got here?
I think it's a couple of things. One, I think it's been a reduction of standards. So it goes to that as our school districts have moved along, they've watered down what you need to know because they began to have struggles. And rather than face up to that fact, they decided to go the other direction and make it easier for kids to get by so that their districts didn't look so bad. I think we also have to reevaluate the way we hire and fire teachers and hold them accountable because I think that there's been a lot of talk, for instance, about union rules that don't allow for advancement, for pay raises, for achievements, or for firings when people aren't doing their jobs well. So I don't blame any of this on our children, by the way. They go off merrily to school and they expect for people to take control, and we're the ones that have failed them.
And when you were talking about other countries earlier, how do you compare our country to others and what they're doing over there that maybe be, more successful?
Yeah, I think other countries, especially if you look at places like China, for instance, but also I think a number of European educational systems. First of all, there is a high level of standards there. Also, there's a low tolerance for any kind of failure, both on the student's part and on the teacher's part. So if you are not, they have not watered down their standards, and if you do not perform, then you're out of a job and things are going to change. And I think that that's the big thing that we've got to get right in this country. We've got to align, we've got to raise our standards, and then we've got to create a system of incentives for achievement and also hold accountable those who aren't achieving.
And like you said too earlier, we don't want to point fingers at anyone, but where can the parents step in and make a difference?
Well, I think that one of the most inspiring things that I have seen happen is since COVID, look, COVID was just terrible in so many ways, but one silver lining of it was all of those kids at home and parents seeing because they were witnessing online classes or they were suddenly much more involved in making sure their kids were hitting their books. They really got an up close and personal look at how many problems there are. And that's not counting all the kids that simply didn't have school for so long, which was tragic and is, a year of learning they will never get back. But one of the exciting things has been the flood of parents that you have seen now running for their school boards, getting involved with new standards and requirements. And I say this to people all the time. People sometimes look at their television, they get all angry about this stuff and they say, what can I do? The thing you can do is get involved locally, even if it's just going to your local school board meetings. They advertise them, they tell them where they are. You've got to be there and you've got to make your feelings known and get involved in making sure the accountability is there.
And I think too, some people might hear this and hear the statistics and just think, wow, this is so daunting. Where do we even begin? Are there resolutions? Are there solutions? What can we do as a community, as a state, and as a country to improve this?
Well, I think, again, one thing that we need to be doing is simply the standards. And we've had a lot of conversation about this over the years. When districts get in particularly rough places where their numbers are looking very bad, one of their solutions is to simply get rid of, for instance, standardized testing, or to lower the level of what you have to accomplish to have apparently accomplished this grade or that graduation. And I think that the standards have to be raised much higher and soon. And look, that is going to be very challenging in the beginning because there's going to be a lot of schools that are not going to hit the targets. But we can't continue going on suggesting that we have a rigorous education system when we do not. So I think that's one of the first things that has to happen. I think the next thing that has to happen is a rationalization of money. There's also been a lot of talk over the years about how more and more of our education dollars have gone not into teachers, but into middle management staffing, and a lot of personnel in schools that are not necessarily in the job of teaching kids, but are support. And yes, we need some of those, but you go back and you look at those one-room schoolhouses, it was one teacher and they managed to accomplish a lot. So we've got to think smarter about our dollars too.
And Kim, personally, you had mom school at your house. And once your kids got out there and used some of those tactics, how did you see them competing with other students who maybe didn't get that mom school or was just going to school like many of the other students?
Yeah, look, I saw this and it actually just broke my heart because I volunteered a lot at my kids' schools. And you could see it. I mean, forget them getting out of school. From the moment they got in, you could begin to see that disparity because the kids who'd had some kind of basis at home, parents that had already taught them how to read or to write or to do some math, or at least had taught them their letters, those kids always did better in school, right? They just began from an advantage. And because it's pretty clear that those basic skills are not really being imparted correctly at school, so that the divergence just went from there. And it's such a commentary on how important it is that, in particular, the earliest years our kids get in school is when we have to be most focused on making sure they are grasping those rudimentary skills. They get those, the rest of it, if you can read and you can do math, then you can learn history, you can learn civics, etc. If you've never obtained those basic skills, you're going to struggle to do everything else.
Struggle to do everything else. You are so right. For people watching with us right now, if they take away one thing, what would that be that you would like them to know?
Get involved in your kids' education and their learning and view it as this opportunity, not just for them, but for you. And, I have to say, I loved my mom's school. They didn't love it. But I mean, I think maybe in retrospect, they look back and think it's not so bad. But, I loved watching their minds grow. And I think that is one difference, too, is that we increasingly as a society compartmentalize things. We put our kids on a bus and we assume that whatever's happening there is going to be all for the good. And we assume it's someone else's responsibility. They're still our kids, right? So that to the extent that you can be involved to a certain degree in your kids' education, both at home, but by being in the school, seeing what happens, or by attending those meetings, that's just the most important thing. We all have to be aware, and then we can fix the problem.
I love it. Thank you so much. You've been so informative. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much,
Thank
Kim.
you.
Coming up next, a detailed examination of state and national achievement results. Experts say it's essential to have a data-driven historical perspective to understand the challenge ahead. Test results aren't the only success indicator, but the trends are very informative. Does the trend indicate students will eventually reach the community's desired proficiency level within an acceptable time frame, or does it indicate that considerable changes may be necessary? Dave Trobert joins us now to examine the data from multiple sources. He is the CEO of Kansas Policy Institute and the Kansas School Board Resource Center and has conducted education research for nearly 2 decades. Before we jump into the data, tell us a little bit about the Kansas Policy Institute and your education work.
Sure. Hi, Jemelle. It's good to be here.
You bet.
The Kansas Policy Institute is a nonprofit research and education organization. We have offices here in Wichita and also in Overland Park. We do a lot of work on education issues, mostly focused on improving student outcomes. We also work on things like constitutional rights, taxes, and other economic issues. About 3 years ago, we started the Kansas School Board Resource Center when we learned that a lot of school board members were saying they couldn't get the information they needed, and they needed training. They needed a lot of help and guidance. So we don't tell them what to do. We really help them. We're an assistant for them. It's why we call it a resource center. It's like going to the library to learn what you want to know. You know, it's shocking when we show them some of their own achievement data. I mean, they'll say this can't be true. And a lot of people in the public say the same thing because that's not what they've been told. They've been at least given the impression that everything's fine. And we all want everything to be good. We want to believe that kids are doing well, not only our own, but everybody else's. Right. We want to believe that. Unfortunately, the results show that it's not that way. And we point this out not to point fingers or assess blame. It's like going to the doctor. You don't want to hear troubling news, but you have to understand the depth of an issue because that's the first step in solving a problem.
Absolutely. And so let's dive in a little bit. Let's start with the NAEP, pronounced NAEP, those results, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so the primary NAEP assessment is given to 4th graders and 8th graders in math and reading. It's administered by the U.S. Department of Education. They do it every other year. Okay. And it's considered, education researchers as well as a lot of education agencies, including the Kansas Department of Education, say that NAEP is the gold standard of comparing student outcomes across states. And so I'm going to just focus here on the 8th grade reading because there's a lot of numbers and it's easy to get lost in them. But if we just start looking at this first graphic on 8th grade reading, what we see is that in 1998, Kansas was a little bit better than the national average. We had 19% of students, 8th graders, below basic, compared to a national average of 27%, and we had 36% proficient, whereas the national average was 33%. So it was above the national average. Not what a lot of parents would say that's what we want, but it was at least that. Now in 2024, which was the latest data, test results are out, Kansas is below the national average and with, unfortunately, some precipitous declines. So, for example, now we've gone from 19% below basic to 34%. We actually have more students below basic in Kansas than are proficient. Only 25% are proficient. Not that the national average is good, but it's at 30%.
Right.
So it's, you know, when you look at this data, it's heartbreaking, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Now, would you say is the decline sudden, like following COVID? Or is this a steady decline that we're seeing? No,
it's been pretty steady. In fact, it was declining long before COVID. You go back to 2015, we really saw a number of declines. Now, to be fair, the nation as a whole has been declining, but Kansas has been declining faster than the nation. In fact, there's only a handful of states that have a worse record in terms of transition than Kansas. So It's unfortunate, but when you look at 2015 on, there's been a pretty steady decline. COVID made it worse, certainly, and there's varying degrees of recovery from that. But even if you get back to pre-COVID levels, they're still scary low.
Okay, and what do you mean by college readiness? And how does that relate to students who don't even go to college? You know, some choose other avenues.
Yeah, well, so college readiness is a term that the ACT uses. And I want to be clear before I go any farther to say that this is not a criticism of students or teachers. It's really a management issue, and it's widespread. It encompasses the Department of Education, the state school board, local school boards, and even the legislature. There's plenty of responsibility to go around. These aren't Democrat, Republican, political type issues. It's just a serious problem that we have to deal with. And so in 2015, the ACT results showed that 32% of Kansas graduates were college ready in all 4 subjects: English, reading, math, and science. Now, that's not great, but at least it was a little bit better than the national average. Since then, we've seen a really precipitous decline, almost steadily each year, going from 32% now down to just 17% of students college ready in English, reading, math, and science.
Boy, and so how has college readiness changed in the last 10 years?
Well, the trend was pretty flat, but in the last 10 years, it's really gone down a great deal. I mean, to be down, the national average is only 20%. And that's a serious problem. I mean, these are, you know, college readiness is, we talk about, people think of just going to college, but it really, I think, applies universally. You need to have basic reading and math skills to go on to trade school or to go into the workforce.
Right.
You have to be able to comprehend and understand what's going on. So it's really life readiness more so than college readiness. And everybody has to be prepared. It's hard to imagine that kids aren't. You know, a few years ago, I was at a meeting of the Overland Park Chamber of Commerce, and we were looking at what a legislative agenda would be, and I was pushing for some more accountability. So I was sharing these numbers, and I said, based on what we're seeing, we know that kids all across Kansas, and including in Johnson County, kids were getting diplomas with schools knowing that some of them couldn't read and do math at grade level. And that caused a bit of an uproar,
right,
as you might imagine. It sounds like you're criticizing schools, and it was just stating a fact. What was interesting, there were 2 people in that room who said nothing. They were school superintendents from Olathe and Shawnee Mission. They couldn't argue the data. They just didn't want to have the conversation. It's hard for people to understand that this exists, but we can't fix it until we acknowledge it.
Yeah, you can't ignore it.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Now, I do have a question. We hear reports that high school graduation rates continue to improve. So how do you reconcile that with college readiness at 17%?
Well, you see, that's a great question. A diploma is not a certification of a student knowing having a certain level of knowledge. It just means you got through 12 grades. I mean, some kids get diplomas with a 4.0 and some might get it with a 1.0. So first of all, it's not really meaningful of what students know or are able to do. In fact, we hear from parents pretty frequently a comment like, hey, my daughter was a 4.0 student in high school. How is she not able to be prepared for college? She's struggling. We're having to enroll her in remedial classes. How is this possible? Well, unfortunately, and again, this is all across the country, students are passed along. It's called social promotion. It's on a timetable rather than whether you are ready to move on to the next grade. And so that's how that happens.
Okay, that's good information. And we've talked about the NAEP and ACT results. What about the state assessment? Are the results similar?
Well, they used to be. The state assessment results for years were very similar to the NAEP results from the U.S. Department of Education. In fact, if you go back and look at the year 2000, they were both like in mid-30s. But then they shot up from 34% to 65% in 1 year. And that's because the State Board of Education changed the proficiency standards. It's like changing the grade scale.
Okay.
It's not this, but it's kind of like going from having 90 to 100 being an A to just maybe 70 to 100 being an A. So yeah, you're going to have a lot more kids getting A's, but it doesn't mean that they know anymore. So you almost double proficiency in 1 year, and then it continues to grow. There was another change in standards, and this is the scoring standard. It's not what they're expected to know. It's like the scale on the test of how well they did. We got to 85% proficient on the state assessment for 8th grade reading in 2015 or 2013. That wasn't given in 14. There was a technical issue. But in 2015, it fell to 30%. Now, students didn't all of a sudden forget how to read. We just changed the grading scale. Right. Kansas went back to having high standards. In fact, the U.S. Department of Education had said since then that Kansas standards for proficiency met the national standards. And there were only a handful of states that did that. Unfortunately, that caused some, people would do comparisons and they would say, well, Kansas is only at 34% proficient and Virginia might be at 70%. Well, the only reason Virginia was at 70% was they had some of the worst standards in the nation. They might have been at 60 to 100 was an A. And so that causes some of the competitive juices get going and they want to make it look better. And so this year, for the 25 test, the state school board implemented new standards. So from 2015 to 2024, the NAEP scores proficient for 8th grade reading were very close, tracked very close to the state assessment.
Okay.
In 24, the state was at 22% proficient for 8th grade reading, and NAEP said 25. So it's like a survey. It's within the margin of error. All of a sudden, Kansas says we went from 22% to 40%. You don't see those kinds of gains unless you change the grading score. But unfortunately, and that eliminates the ability to track. I mean, yeah, we want to feel like it's better, but I'll go back to that doctor analogy. We have to really understand what the issue is. And then we have to be able to put a solution in place and track progress. And we can't do that if we interrupt the trend with different proficiency levels at the state.
Yeah, and some people say that the national standard for proficiency is too high and that it's more aspirational than realistic. Yeah. How do you respond to that, Dave?
Well, I'll let the viewers decide. If you look at the national standard for proficient, its definition is that students have solid academic performance. The next level down is basic, which is partial mastery of the skills they need. So do you think that the community at large would want solid academic performance or just partial mastery? We'd look better if the standard is partial mastery, but that's honestly not doing students any favor. We need to be honest. So I don't think that the national standard for proficient is aspirational by any means.
Well, thank you, Dave, so much for being here. And this information, the data is certainly sobering. But understanding the depth of a problem is essential. In our next segment, we'll discuss how the literacy crisis affects higher education and the workforce. Welcome back. I'm your host, Jemelle Holopirek. Educational leaders say the data we just reviewed shows outcomes that are much lower than we need for students and the community to succeed. Still, some people are understandably hesitant to rely on data alone. And in this segment, we'll hear from representatives of higher education and the business community. Our panel includes Dr. Blake Flanders, President and CEO, Kansas Board of Regents. We have Heather Morgan, Executive Director of the Kansas Association of Community Colleges, Eric Stafford, Vice President of the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, and Eric Estes, President and CEO of Estes Enterprises, Inc., and Restaurant and Real Estate Corporation. He is also an executive at Buckland Tractor in Pratt. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it so much. So we'll get right with it, okay? First off, the first question, the state and national testing data shows that about a third of Kansas students struggle to read and college readiness is declining. Now, how much of a problem is this for higher education in places like the workforce as well? Not just higher education, but also the workforce. So we'll get to the workforce in just a minute. But first off, with the institutions in higher education.
Yeah, so I think as we look at this issue, it certainly is a problem for higher education. We rely on students, coming from high schools to enroll in our colleges and universities. And someone that doesn't read well typically doesn't do well in any subject, whether it be math or history or English Comp 1. And what we know is that most people, if you don't do something well, you don't continue to do it.
Right.
And so typically, I think students that don't read well are going to be less likely to attend a post-secondary institution or an institution of higher education.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, you work with a lot of people in the workforce and just coming out of college and getting into their first job or businesses. What are you seeing?
Yeah, the sentiment that we hear from our membership in the business community from across the state is that on the technical side, there's not as much dissatisfaction as there is with more of the soft skill side, which I think ties into the literacy issue. And to Dr. Flanders' point, that when you struggle in those areas, it impacts other soft skills. Your ability to communicate with verbal or written communication obviously is essential on a day-to-day basis. Teamwork and collaboration is important. And so those softer skills, we continue to hear from the business community that's the biggest problem facing the workforce in the state today.
Now, Heather, is this something just recent we're seeing, or has this been going on for some time?
Community colleges accept all students and we meet them where they are. We've always had some students who needed to have remediation in reading, but we are also seeing an increase in number of students who want to get into technical programs, but that lack of literacy skill is holding them back. For example, when we talk to our nursing educators, there are a lot of students who want to get into nursing, but they don't have the literacy skills to pass the test to get into the program. And so a lot of things related to technical education are really dependent on literacy. You have to be able to read technical materials, and not being able to do that is limiting some students in ways that you might not think.
And Eric, you are a business leader in many different areas. What are you seeing with some of these students coming out?
So we've been seeing this for quite some time. If you look at even pre-COVID, where COVID didn't help us any, obviously, but if you look at our companies in general, I think on the EEI side, we've had nearly 20,000 Kansas employees come through that C corporation, and so that's a great feat. It's been challenging lately, and I'd say every year since. To find not only the student that comes out with that skill as far as reading, writing, arithmetic, we've been seeing challenges in the ability to want to work or to apply themselves or even know what they can or can't do. And so in the work world, we have opportunities, whether you want to do in marketing, culinary, if you want to sell, be a salesperson, a diesel technician. And so it's more challenging for us in the work world, in the business world, and in the retail world to find and place that employee in something that they themselves aren't quite comfortable with or don't know.
Absolutely. Now, educators, this may be a question for you, but help the viewers understand how this came about and talk about any actions you are taking to address the lack of preparedness so these students can become more prepared. But what's being done?
Yeah, so we want to stay in our lane and say, what can we do to help this issue? And really something that we've had in partnership with the Kansas legislature is the blueprint for literacy. And And why did that come to higher education? You might say, well, this is not a higher education issue. Well, it is, in that we're preparing all the teachers. And we also need to have programs where teachers in the field that need a seal of literacy can also access higher education and take that training and education they need. And so we've had a really good start in terms of training and retraining teachers, making sure that our programs have enough content and credit hours that really focus on the science of reading. And then one thing that our Director of Literacy, Cindy Lane, has really been insistent on is to use a medical model, if you will, for the education. So not only the theory behind the science of reading, but also coaching and a practicum that you're actually practicing those skills and improving underneath that leadership.
Absolutely, because it takes a team.
Yeah.
Everybody has to work together to solve this problem,
Agreed.
right?
Agreed.
Absolutely. Now, do employers need to take similar remedial actions? Also, are employees and employers facing any non-academic workforce challenges among high school graduates? Are you seeing other things when you are hiring these students coming out of college? Maybe just not when it comes to schoolwork and grades, but other things.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the soft skill issue, time management, showing up to work on time, and just understanding simple things that you don't really learn in a textbook in science or reading or math. So I think there's some training or retraining that has to happen on a just a, I would call a low skill expectation level that has to take place. But I think ultimately it points down to the partnerships that the business community has with the educational institutions, community colleges, technical schools, universities, having those strategic partnerships so they can hear directly from the employers what's important and what's needed. And they've historically been really good about adapting to the needs from the business community. So I think it's just regular communication that employers need to make sure that they share with the higher ed community and working to get employees trained in the state of Kansas.
And Eric, what can people do, or what do you think the legislature can do when it comes to this?
So I think people can do a couple of things. In the business world, we call it life skills. And I feel like a lot of the students that are coming out of high school, going into the college, are lacking that basic life skill process. So, is it something as simple as, how do I buy a car? How do I pay for rent in an apartment complex, and I want to go to work for this retailer, but how do I do that and pay my bills? And those are life skills that we see coming into the workforce, and I'm, as we interview them and we onboard them and give them a job, also I find that we are adapting as retailers and as business managers to offer those life skills while they work for us. And I found that has been so instrumental, like you just said, coming to work on time. A lot of us grew up in different generations. And in my generation, my grandfather and my father was, hey, work starts at 6, but if you're at 6, you're late. So I grew up with a different generational mantra, whereas we try to incorporate some of those basic life skills to our employees, and it's been very successful.
I love that. I think that is so important that you realize, and I think some kids need to know, we were talking earlier, I have a 22-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a teenager, that if you do those things, you can become a success, but you've got to do it all. You've got to have the education, and then you've got to have the grit to do it. Absolutely. Now, if you could make one request, Heather, and this is for you, of local school board members, what would it be? What would you ask school board members?
I think that I would ask school board members to ensure that every student in their building has foundational reading skills. It doesn't matter whether the student's going to the military, coming to a community college, going to do a technical career, or go on to university. Everyone needs to have basic literacy skills, and then the soft skills that the business community needs. If a student has grit and want to, and some basic skills, I think higher education can help them go wherever they want to go.
Were you guys surprised as a whole by the data that's come out about the literacy crisis in Kansas? Eric, you're shaking your head no.
I was not. We see it, and so we have online resumes, that you can that a student or an employee can fill out online, any kind of opportunity for an application. And of recent, we're finding it more and more challenging and more difficult as we receive these. We rack and stack them. They go into the store. The manager sets up an in-live interview, and we'll set up with a supervisor, and we'll find that the person that shows up that presented us with that was filled out using an application process, an app, and a chat. So we asked them, did you get some help filling this out? Yes, there's an app for that. And so we find that there's a disparity there, and it's like we want to know that we're talking to the person that can fill this out, that if I ask a question, I said, tell me about yourself.
Right.
That can they tell me about themselves? And it's not that we can't work with inadequacy, we can, but we just need to know who we're dealing with. And I think that today's technology with the FaceTime that everyone has on a screen allows them abilities that didn't used to happen generations ago. You can Google answers, you can use chatbots, you can use AI. And so there's different variables that we're faced today.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's a totally different generation now. I mean, technology is incredible, but it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. What would you guys like to comment about that coming from educators?
Yeah, so I tell you, I was surprised because sometimes I think we see all the students at the colleges and universities who've made it there. And just incredibly high achieving. I actually think our future's really bright.
Good. I'd love to hear that.
I think we're going to have an incredibly productive generation, and we are going to get this turned around. But we see the students who already made it into college or made it to the university, and we need an economy. And we need the entire population participating in the economy. We did a study just to make sure that our programs are on the right track and targeted. Out of the University of Kansas, we had an economist, Dr. Donna Ginther, that did a study and looked at the number of new jobs being created from 2020 to 2030. And of the new jobs, 50,000 new jobs, about 85% of those required a baccalaureate level or higher. So they might start at one of Heather's community colleges and get their associate degree, transfer to the university. But that's the level of skill now that's required. And we used to think, and I'm an advocate of career and technical education, but we used to think, well, that job doesn't require as much. Well, that's not true anymore. If you look at a vehicle and open the hood, that engine's very different than it was 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
And so the level of skill needed to succeed in this economy is going to continue to increase. And that's why we need to really address this issue.
Before we go, I'd just like to ask all of you, if you could give a piece of advice to our parents and those upcoming students, legislature, school board members, everybody as a whole, because it's going to take the whole team. What advice would you give them to keep our students going and improve this literacy issue?
Yeah, I think emotion can always rule the day. Everyone wants to think that things are going well for their student, or I think you need to know the numbers, know the data of your local school, and I think that would go a long way into really getting people to get behind this issue and address this problem.
I would say that back to Eric's point about IT and AI and all of those things, that after you know the data and understand that the careers of tomorrow are going to take a higher skilled person, make sure that we're not allowing our students to rely on listening to something or reading something by listening, and have those basic skills, because when you're out in the workplace, it's not always realistic to use that app or to have something read to you online. And so I would say make sure we have those basic fundamental skills that are really going to be transferable in the workplace.
Yeah, I'd probably just encourage parents to stay engaged, but get engaged very early in your children's education. Use the opportunity to mentor today's youth, even just little tips here and there professionally about what can help get them ready for when time comes to graduate high school. Because a lot of students, I think when you graduate high school, you think, okay, well, what now? It's like you start encouraging them to think what they would like to be, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and how do they use their strengths to their advantage I think just being very engaged with your children and your children's friends and encouraging them to think about what their career path might be.
Great advice. Rick?
I agree. Early intervention is great. The sooner they can start to identify what their children, really like to do, and this is their passion. I always find that as they get into the junior, senior, or even in college, they say, "Man, I really want to weld." Well, go to welding technical school, or I really want to go to law and practice law. Find a great law school, and you can really dial that in. I think you can do that at an earlier age. So I see it in the business world that some of these students come to me and we put them in a job placement. I found out they're incredible at this other thing that they thought they were going to be good at. And I said, "You're going to be incredible at this." And they'll go into culinary and open their own restaurant. And I've had that happen. And it's just phenomenal to me how much, talent these kids really do have. But getting on to that early would be great.
Absolutely. And doing what you love. You never work another day in your life, right? Well, thank you all for being here. We truly appreciate it, taking your time and helping Kansans understand how the literacy crisis impacts higher education and the workforce. When we return, we'll talk about the unique constitutional and statutory structure of the Kansas education system and how tension between the education system and the legislature impacts the literacy crisis in Kansas schools. A school district's organizational structure is simple. The local school board is in charge, and the superintendent reports to the board. The overall structure of the education system is more complex. However, some educational leaders say there is tension among the legislature, the state school board, and the Department of Education over responsibility and authority. Mike O'Neill joins us now to talk about the legal structure of the education system. Mike is an attorney who served 30 years in the Kansas House of Representatives, including 2 terms as Speaker of the House. Mike, let's start with the Kansas Constitution. What does it say about the education system?
Well, we actually have 4 provisions of the Kansas Constitution that come into play. The first one is Article 2, Section 1, which is not the education article, but it is the provision in the Constitution that places all legislative power within the legislature, the House and the Senate. And so that sort of overrides everything else. Then there's Article 6, which is the education article. And Article 1, or Section 1 of the Constitution under Article 6 says the legislature shall provide for intellectual, educational, vocational, and scientific improvement by establishing and maintaining public schools, educational institutions, and related activities which may be organized and changed in such manner as may be provided by law. And anytime you see the phrase "as provided by law," you're talking about the legislative power of the House and Senate. Then Article 6, Section 2 says the legislature shall provide for a state board of education which shall have general supervision of public schools, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Educational institutions and all educational interests of the state. And then, importantly, the State Board of Education shall perform such other duties as may be provided by law, which is another way of saying the legislature can direct and mandate the State Board do other functions that are above and beyond their constitutional supervisory powers. Article 6, Section 5 is the one that invests in the local boards the power to maintain, develop, and operate locally elected boards. So think of it as sort of a triangle with the legislature at the top under Article 2, Section 1, and then the local boards which exercise local control, and then the state board, the other leg of the stool, having general supervisory powers.
And Mike, some state school board members say that they believe the board is a 4th branch of government. Now, is there any legal validity to this?
Well, no, there isn't, and that kind of goes back to Article 2, Section 1 that says that the sole legislative power to make laws, is vested in the Senate and the House. There was a Supreme Court case, we call it the Peabody case, back in the 70s, that indicated that the constitutional article gave the state board self-executing powers, and that has somehow been misinterpreted to mean they can do whatever they want. However, it's been very clear in all the Supreme Court decisions that have followed that self-executing simply means that the legislature didn't need to, by statute, say that the state board had general supervision of the public schools, because that was already in the Constitution. The court went on to say that a provision can be self-executing in part and not self-executing in other parts, and reminded us that the legislature was required to create the State Board of Education in the first place.
Now, what is the definition of general supervision?
It's interesting how the court has addressed that over the years. In that same case that I referenced, that the court indicated that the definition of general supervision, literally, this is a quote, means something more than to advise and something less than control. Now that seemed to be a little bit vague, but every single court decision that's interpreted that provision since, up until today, has used the same definition. Something more than advise, but something less than control. Because the control ultimately is at the local board level. The constitutional power of the state board is limited to general supervision. And the court cases have also made it very clear that the Constitution limits rather than grants power. And so the constitutional authority of the state board is limited to general supervision. Less than control, something more than to advise.
Okay, and we've heard self-executing. Explain what self-executing authority means.
The Supreme Court has interpreted that to simply mean that it requires no additional legislation to make it active. And so look at it this way. The Constitution says that the state board shall have general supervision of public schools. Self-executing means the legislature didn't have to follow up with a statute that says, oh, by the way, the State Board of Education shall have general supervision of the public schools, because that was already stated in the Constitution. Nothing more, nothing less. It did not somehow create more power in the state board than is expressed in the Constitution.
And give us a few examples of legislative direction to the state school board that are intended to improve student outcomes, and are they having the intended effect?
Well, keep in mind, this is a short segment, but the education article in the statute books is chapter 72, and I've counted close to 900 separate enactments that the legislature has passed. One in particular is KSA 72-255, which is a legislative delegation of power to the state board. And a legislative delegation means that these are things that are by their very nature legislative, but the legislature has the power to delegate certain functions. Remember that the constitutional provision said the state board shall perform such other functions as may be required by law. And so, for example, school libraries and other educational materials is something that was delegated to the state board. Courses of study and curriculum, accreditation of schools, including elementary and secondary, certification of administrators, teachers, and counselors. And that's just one statute that has made some specific statements as to what they want the board to do. Those are all functions that by nature are legislative, but the legislature has had the power to then delegate those responsibilities to the state board.
Right, and what happens if one of those laws is not followed?
That seems to be an issue that comes up in the legislature annually. The legislature, frankly, has become frustrated over the years that legislative intent and direction has not been always carried out by the board. And particularly in the area of accreditation, the use of application of requirements under the at-risk funding laws, school-based needs assessments. And generally, the legislature has addressed those by basically passing new legislation that says, hey, we really mean it. In other words, putting more teeth into the statute. Ultimately, legally, if the board would refuse to implement something that the legislature has directed, the legal remedy is an action in mandamus, which of course we would like to avoid if at all possible. The Constitution really contemplates that this is a cooperative effort between the legislature, state board, and local boards to create a great educational system. It's not a competition. It really is a cooperative effort, and we try very much to have all the players play nice with each other.
And now, what are some options for the legislature and the state school board to be on the same page?
Well, obviously, following the legislative or the constitutional directive and appreciating where each has a role, first we've got to have respect for that. One of the examples of us all getting on the same page is a rare occasion when the State Board of Regents, the State Board of Education, the Department of Education, and the legislature got together and globally acknowledged that literacy, reading aptitude and assessments in Kansas were dismally low. And so we've now mandated the science of reading. And that was a cooperative effort. That's the way the Constitution intended the parties to get together. And so what we try to do is in the legislation that is promulgated, we try to get buy-in from the parties and make sure that we're all on the same page and cooperating, because at the end of the day, the goal is to provide every child in the state of Kansas with an acceptable education that allows them to meet grade level expectations year after year. There has been an acknowledgement by the Department of Education that we kind of have a red light and siren situation facing us. We've got graduation rates that are going through the roof, which the department applauds, but at the same time, our proficiency levels are going down, and that is just that graphic is very hard to accept, and so we're trying very hard to make sure that we keep the eye on the ball, and graduation rates are good, but we want those diplomas to mean something. We want the diploma to mean that this child who is graduating has reached acceptable levels of proficiency such that they will be successful in post-secondary life or a career life. And that should be a goal that all three, the legislature, the state board, and the local districts ought to be striving to achieve.
Absolutely, Mike, because that's what it's all about, is getting these kids set up for success once they do graduate from high school or college.
Yeah, and the thing that's probably frustrated us more than anything is, as you know, the state was involved in litigation for a number of years. And at the peak of that, I was still in the legislature at the time in 2005, and I was able to get a provision placed in statute that established a state policy goal that new money that the courts were forcing us to spend would be spent on instruction or in the classroom. And that statute was a state policy goal of 65% of funds going to the classroom. That state policy goal was never met when monies were actually allocated. It's not the responsibility of the legislature to allocate the funds once they're appropriated. The legislature appropriates the funds, and then there is discretion by the department and the board to determine how it's going to be spent. That number, the actual number in the classroom, is wavered between 52% and 54% for the last 20 some years. So let's think about that. The legislature appropriated plenty of funds. Those funds were spent, but only a little over 50% were spent on instruction when the state policy goal is 65%. The cumulative effect of money that didn't get to the classroom that should have is now, I think, over $13 billion. And that is indefensible. Even the USD accounting handbook stresses the importance of instruction, and it basically says if this function doesn't operate as it should, all other expenditures, all other functions will fail. And that is essentially a plea that local budgets be built from the classroom up, not the administration building down. And so we have continued to preach that we really need the local districts to take the building-based needs assessment seriously, find out what the needs are, stress instruction, and I think if you do that, you'll get it right. Not having budgets just kind of presented to local boards for them to rubber stamp, but have local boards have a real role in making sure that the needs of each building in each school district are served.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We truly appreciate it, taking time out and joining us. And he kind of talked about the constitutional overview of the Kansas education system, and we really appreciate that. Now, this concludes part one of resolving the literacy crisis in Kansas schools. In part two, we will examine some of the major barriers preventing students from getting the education they need. I'm Jemelle Holopirek, and I'll see you then.
Support for this program was provided by the Kansas School Board Resource Center.